for joining us. Tonight we're really here, it's all about our waterways and catchments. The mid-coast waterways are some of the most important parts of the landscape that we have in this area. We all know how important they are to us. We all live here for a reason, and a lot of that has to do with our waterways. And it's really the health of those waterways that keeps our communities thriving. They're also very important for wildlife that lives in our region. There is so many benefits to having healthy waterways. And so to achieve the best outcomes for our waterways, we really rely on a variety of different research, monitoring, modelling, and local knowledge to help guide us in how we look after our waterways. And so tonight we're going to be celebrating the science involved in all of this work. So every year we welcome scientists from the Department of Planning, Industry, Environment, and they come and visit our region and undertake sampling in our estuaries. They do that for a couple of reasons. We do a lot of different sampling in a lot of different areas, and it's to look at how our waterways are faring when compared to other waterways throughout New South Wales. It's really about getting some baseline data, looking at how those waterways are doing from year to year, and also just seeing what effects our management actions are having on our waterways. So tonight we're going to talk not only about the report card, but also the results for 2020. So we've obviously got some interesting things happening there. And we're also going to talk about the science behind the monitoring that we undertake, the ways that we use our catchment modelling and monitoring to help target our management actions and have the most positive outcomes for our waterways. Now, obviously, we all live in this region, and we're all aware of the interesting and very hard climatic conditions that we've been facing over the last couple of years. Obviously, we've had extreme drought, bushfires, flooding, and all of that happened during our 2020 sampling period. So it was really influenced those climatic conditions, so we'll be talking about that tonight as well. So just before we get started for the evening, and I introduce you to the special guests that will be talking to us, I would like to play a video for you. It just gives you some background information on what the report card actually is, what indicators the scientists use when undertaking the monitoring, and what we've been doing with this information.
So the first report card was released in 2011, and this was after the adoption of the Great Lakes Water Quality Improvement Plan. And in the plan we identified the need for a report card that would help us track the health of our waterways. What the report card also does is it helps us check that the strategic framework that we set up as part of that Water Quality Improvement Plan is actually working. The value of the report card is that we have an independent assessment each year of the health of our waterways, and this is completed by the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment.
The two main issues that we have in our estuaries are the introduction of nutrients, which washes off our land. The other main problem is sediments and soils. When we're doing the monitoring, we're focusing on those two main causes of concern, and we have indicators that respond to those. So we measure the amount of algae in our water, because that is a direct response to the amount of nutrients that we have in the water. And we measure something called turbidity, which is a way of measuring how clear or how murky the water is, because that's a direct response to the amount of soil and sediment that's washing into the waterways. Soil and sediment can affect many aspects of what lives in our waterways. It can harm our seagrasses, which are critical for the ecology and for sheltering juvenile fish and other organisms. And if we have too much algae in our systems, it can cause problems for the fish, can cause problems for the seagrass, and it can just make the water not look very nice.
The main indicators for estuary health that we're looking at are chlorophyll A concentrations and turbidity. We also collect other contextual data looking at salinity, temperature, pH, dissolved oxygen. We also look at seagrass depth ranges in a few of the estuaries up here.
We use a complex series of scientific investigations. Often we use models to help us get all of the information together. And we use that information to predict how our actions will change our environment.
We use the report card results to work out how our waterways are faring in terms of their ecological health. And when we see areas that need improvement, it helps us target our programs to improve the condition of the water running off of our catchments. The results of the report card are affected by a number of diffuse sources of pollution, so there's no single solution to improving water quality. Council have a range of projects that we put in place to improve water quality and waterway health. One of them is to conserve and restore wetlands and improve their function and ability to filter nutrients and sediments. In urban areas, we undertake stormwater improvement projects. Things like wetlands and bioretentions are built into the urban form so that they can also filter the nutrients and sediments that come off our urban landscape. On rivers, we undertake bank stabilisation so that the banks don't fall in the river. We undertake partnerships with farmers and local land services to engage with farmers to improve the way they manage their land so that they can improve their production outcomes but also reduce the amount of runoff and impact on water quality. We restore our bushland areas so that they can function effectively as filters for stormwater and runoff from the catchment, and that involves bush regeneration and weeding. One of the more obvious pollution sources from our urban areas is litter, so we've got some integrated programs with our community and local land services to reduce the amount of litter entering our estuaries. The report card results don't just belong to Council. Our community have told us that our waterways are really important to them, and keeping them healthy is one really important part of that. Each year we release the report cards and we share them with our community, and we use that as an opportunity to engage with our community about the waterways, how important they are, and talk to them about the results.
I like keeping an eye on these estuaries because they're always changing and there's always something new to look at and something interesting to see.
What I really like about working on the report card project is that I can see the use of evidence-based decision making in action, and we continue to refine our program so we get the best investment of Council's money and the best outcome for our waterways.
It's a great overview of what the report card project is, how long we've been doing it. It's been a long time that we've been undertaking this project in the Mid-Coast area. So it's great that we get to do this annually, and it's a really important part, not only for us, but for our community to see what's going on. So I'll start to introduce our scientists that are with us this evening. So first of all, we have joining us Dr. Peter Skanes, who is the Senior Team Leader of Estuaries and Catchment Science for the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment. He leads a team of 15 scientists and has worked on estuary and coastal river ecology for over 30 years, and he's been very involved in the report card project right from the very beginning. We also have Aaron Wright, who is our senior scientist with Estuaries and Catchments in the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment as well. And he's been working on a variety of different projects. He has been involved in the report card and the monitoring that goes into that, but he also is working on some specialist science this year, looking at the effects of the bushfires that happen not only here but on the south coast as well. So he'll be talking to us about that this evening. And then finally we have Dr. Angus Ferguson, who is a senior research scientist also with DPIE. He's got over 30 years experience in utilising best scientific method to plan management actions for environmental outcomes, and this includes a lot of work with catchment modelling, both in other areas of New South Wales and looking at some of the work that's been done here in the Mid-Coast as well. And finally, we also have Prue Tucker, who is the Water Quality and Estuary Program Coordinator for MidCoast Council. She has over 20 years experience in estuary management, including extensive works on the Water Quality Improvement Plan that was created for Wallace and Mile Lakes. So I'll hand over to Peter to begin with. He's going to talk for us first and tell us all about the work that he's been undertaking and the results for this year.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. So I've really got two things to talk about. I want to talk about the importance of monitoring and try and emphasise why the council put so much effort into their monitoring and getting their monitoring right. And I'm also going to do a quick presentation of the report card scores from this year's report card. Okay, so if we think about management and the decision making in management as a cycle, we'll start up here with the research that goes on behind that work. It's about improving understanding of how the system works so that we can understand which levers to pull and what are the likely reactions of the system to our management. And some of the things that Aaron will be talking about is in this improved understanding. Once we've got this improved understanding, we can plan our policies and our future actions, which can then be implemented. And the next step is about monitoring. So we need to monitor whether or not the actions that we've implemented are having the effects that we assume that they will, or that we predict that they will have. So this is a cycle, and then we go back and we evaluate the results from the monitoring. That improves our understanding, and then we can make more informed decisions up here. In New South Wales, we've got a statewide program, and that program has looked at almost all of the estuaries in New South Wales over the last few years. It looks at the North region, the Central region and the South region once every third year, and it deals with about 30 to 40 estuaries in each region. So it doesn't cover everything every year, but many of the councils have chosen to build on that core program and increase the number of sites and the frequency of sites within their local government areas, because it gives them more information. And that's the genesis of the program that produces the report cards that we'll be talking about. In the 1920 sampling period, so we sample over summer, so we talk about a summer. The summer started in 2019, finished in 2020. It was one of the wettest years that we've actually, summers that we've actually had for the last 20 odd years, 24 years, but it all came in one big dump. So you can see in these graphs down the bottom here that for most of the summer we were well below average, and then suddenly we got quite a very large storm here, which was produced something like 4.5 times the average monthly rainfall. So it's that single event which has pushed this summer total rainfall well up into the high category. This is the data from Wouter and the data from Taree, so it fell across virtually all of the local government area. If we look in detail, the bars here are where we sampled, and the blue is the rainfall, the daily rainfall. So you can see that this daily rainfall fell between our 4th and 5th sample, and that's really quite important because it really affected the results. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but if you look at the technical report, you'll be able to see that we had quite good scores in this first period when there was no rain, and the scores deteriorated quite a bit after that heavy rainfall. So this is the overall picture that we got from the local government area. 9 out of the 18 sites dropped by 1 grade. So the scores that they got were worse than they were last year. And we put this down to a combination of the drought, fire and the flood. It's really not possible at the sort of scale of the sampling that we do to disentangle drought and fire and flood. But we do understand how they have effects, and that the effects are all mixed together or integrated in together to change the grades in half of our sites. Just very quickly on how to interpret the diagrams that I'm going to show. For each place that we sample, in this case Kappangat, this year's score is up here. The scores over the last 10 years are shown down here. So in 2019, Kappangat got a C, and in this year it also got a C. And this bar here shows our 2 indicators, algae and water clarity. The black is this year's score, and the further to the left it is, the worse it is, and the grey is last year's score. So you can see that algae was quite a bit worse, and the water clarity was quite a bit worse in Kappangat. If we look at the mid-Willamber estuary here, we've got the same structure. except the score was the same in the 2 years. In this case, the algae was slightly improved on last year, and the water clarity was slightly worse than last year. I'll come back to some of these measures. And the colours relate to where you fit in the state scores as they were about 10 years ago. So deep green is an A, which is in the best 20% of the state, and you can go back through these other scores. So we get on to the results. Taking the Wallace Lake catchment first, the scores dropped in Willamba Cove over near, and in Pipers Creek and in Charlottes Bay. Charlottes Bay, for the first time since we've been monitoring since 2007, didn't score an A. So even Charlottes Bay was affected by that massive rainstorm we had. In the middle of Wallace Lake, again, where the scores went down, and in the Kalungaluk estuary it went down, and the mid-Willamba estuary was pretty much the same as it was last year and for most of the last 5 years. In the Manning catchment, we've got many sites, but we've grouped them together into the upper and the mid and the lower Manning estuary. The scores went down in the upper Manning estuary, but stayed constant in the mid and the lower Manning estuary. We've only got one other data point for the Dawson River, but this year was scored more poorly than last year. As Farquhar Inlet, we got the same grade that we did last year. And at the Kappangat Saltwater Creek estuary site, which is in the middle of a national park, we've got one of the poorest scores that we've had in the last 10 years at that site. And Kappangat was quite badly affected by the fires. In the Mile Lakes catchment, you can see that the Bomber Broadwater, arrow around the wrong one, the Bomber Broadwater, the score went down from an A to a B this year, but last year was the first time it got an A, so it's pretty much back where it is. It's interesting to see that every so often, after big floods in the Mile catchment, that the Bomber scores very, very poorly. Mile Lake and the Lower Mile Estuary had the similar scores, or the same scores as last year. And the same story in the Karua and the Branch estuaries both scored Cs, which is only fair. It indicates a reasonably large amount of disturbance in the system. And in the Karua and the Branch, that mostly relates to excessive growth of algae. The scores this year were the same as the scores last year. And Smiths Lake, again, for the first time since we've been doing this work back in 2011, scored a B rather than A. So it indicates that this was quite a pervasive event across the entire local government area, and has pushed down scores in many of the sites that scored quite highly in the past. So what I want to talk about now is getting onto the science and what we can do with these report card grades. So sometimes people scoff at the report cards and say the calculation of this grade just dumbs everything down. And I take exception to that, because I think that there's a lot more information involved in the way we calculate the report card scores, and it doesn't dumb things down. It synthesises the information in a way that we hope that the broader community can fully understand what's going on. Two parts of the report card score when we calculated it is whether the percentage of time that the data that we collect are greater than a guideline value, and how far they are from the guideline value to what we call a worst value. So if it's right up here, it's a much worse outcome than if the data are here and just above the guideline value. And I want to explore how we can use both this proportion value and the distance value to get more information. So I've chosen just 4 sites, Pipers Creek, and Charlotte's Bay, and on the next slide I'll talk about the Wollamba and the Kappengat estuaries. So you can see that for most of the time, Piper's Creek, this is the chlorophyll value, and this is the proportion of time it doesn't comply, sits here on average around about 60% of the time it doesn't comply. But if we look at the average distance, it's only just by a very small amount that it's not complying. So it's saying to us that pretty consistently at Piper's Creek we see values that are only just above the guideline value for chlorophyll, and most of the time they're below the guideline value for turbidity. Charlotte's Bay, we see a similar sort of story, but it's better because only about 20% of the time does Charlotte's Bay not comply with algae, and it always complies for turbidity. But you can also see that sometimes we have these events which really increase the amount of time that, increase the distance that it is away from the guideline value. So it gets much worse. We had one of these events back in 2009, and this event in this year was the highest distance that it was away from the value. And that's what created that poor value that we had, or the poor score, or the reduction in score that we saw this time round. In Kappengat, you see that most of the time it does comply, but when it doesn't by a long way. So what we're seeing is infrequent, very large events, particularly in turbidity, that are causing the non-compliance in the Kappengat. The Wollamba River started off up quite high, particularly for turbidity, and over time it's gradually got complies more often, and the times when it goes over, it doesn't go over by very much. The algae in Wollamba, however, most of the time, or virtually all the time, it doesn't comply, and it seems like the distance away, so that's the severity of the non-compliance, is actually getting worse over time. And when we plot those data, we can see that the amount of algae in the Wollamba River is steadily increasing over time, and that points to a need to really work hard to control the amount of nutrients that are coming into the Wollamba River to stop this trend of increasing severity of the algal growth in the river. So I know that was a bit technical, but I put it in there just to show that there's actually a lot of science and a lot more information that we can get from our report card information than simply the scores that we present back to you. And this information helps us analyse what's going on in the system and to have further confidence or further analysis of what sort of management actions need to be taken. So in conclusion, monitoring is actually absolutely essential to effective management. So without good monitoring, you don't know whether or not your management is having the desired effect, and you need to go back and check that all the time. We saw a general decrease in report card scores in this year, which we put down to that extreme rainfall event, which was preceded by the bushfires, and that the report card score calculations can tell us a lot more about the system and the trajectory or the pathway in the system of our indicators, rather than simply the scores and the grades. So thank you very much. I'll now hand over to my colleagues to continue.
Thanks, Peter. That was fantastic. So that's our report card scores for this year. And as Peter mentioned, there was a few different things that were happening that were affecting our report card scores this year. So next we're going to hand over to Aaron Wright, who has been doing a little bit of research into the ways that the bushfires impacted waterways throughout New South Wales.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me and see me. My name is Aaron Wright. I'm a senior scientist in the Estuaries and Catchments team, as Aaron kindly introduced me earlier. And this evening, I'm going to talk to you about the potential impact of bushfires on estuarine water quality. This evening, I'll give you a really brief rundown of the extent of the fires in the MidCoast LGA. showing how bad things were, basically. I'll spend most of my time presenting our conceptual understanding of the effects of fire. And using a case study, I'll highlight how some of the impacts are being presented in real life, and then quickly cover what can come next. So this is MidCoast LGA, or the catchments of the waterways within the LGA, at least. So you've got the Manning River up in the north, all the way down to the Mile River entering Port Stephens in the south. And it's quite the vast area, and it's got lots of beautiful waterways. Now, this is the extent of the fire across the LGA throughout 2019 and early 2020, but also the severity of each fire. So the darker red and almost kind of black colour is extreme severity, and the lighter colours towards the green is low severity. And what that really means is basically how hot the fire was, and also how high. So at the lower end of the scale, the ground cover in the mid-story, the ground cover is quite burnt, but the mid-story and the canopy are left intact. But at the upper end of the scale, all strata in the vegetated area is damaged, from the ground cover all the way up to the canopy, and it's more or less full combustion. Now that's really important because that controls the type of material left in the catchment after the fire is extinguished, and the type of material can have different varying degrees of impact once it finds its way to a waterway downstream. So you can see the fires around Crowdy Bay, just north of the Manning entrance there. It's all black, so that's, that was a really severe fire. And then there's a spread of the other severity classes across the LGA. So this is some numbers behind those maps. You can see Kappangat Creek, the intermittently closed system just south of Old Bar, had over 80% of its catchment area impacted by fire, and a number of other systems in the LGA were also impacted fairly extensively. The photos there try to convey the differences in the fire severity. So low on the left-hand side, where you can see the canopy in the mid-story is mostly intact. You move along all the way to the other side, the right-hand side, where almost everything is combusted to ash and ruin. Now, onto our conceptual model. Just to point out, this was developed by synthesizing current understanding in relevant literature, discussions with relevant experts, and also based on preliminary data and observations made in fire-affected systems. And this is mostly from data we've collected on the New South Wales South Coast. But similar estuary types to those impacted by fire exist in the MidCoast LGA as well. So the intermittently closed systems, and of course Manning, the big river. So as a point of comparison, this is our understanding of a low disturbance system with a forested catchment before any fire. Water quality in this scenario is generally pretty good. The intact vegetation does a lot to reduce runoff, flow volumes and velocities during rainfall. Nutrients and sediment and organic matter are pretty well secure, so the export to the waterway is pretty low. This is a general model, but it's fairly true of most estuary types. But of course, different processes within the water column and sediments will be occurring at different rates based on the estuary type. So following fire and heavy rain, so lots of runoff shortly after, these are the initial impact conditions. What would have been happening in the January and the February in the mid-coast area. And you can see it's pretty bad. Vegetation is reduced to debris, charcoal, ash, and a mix of partially burnt and partially intact organic matter. And from that, you can expect an increase in stream power, and flow volumes due to ash-laden hydrophobic soils, and this results in both rill and channel erosion in the catchment, and this of course releases increased amounts of sediments, burnt, unburnt and partially burnt organic matter and nutrients as well from the catchment area, and this all ultimately ends up in a downstream waterway. Now, it seems likely in this scenario that the export rates are modulated by fire severity. So most of these processes are made worse with increasing severity. In the receiving environment, there's this plume of highly turbid debris and organic matter rich fresh water. And once that hits low energy environments like shallow margin habitats or deeper basins, that material is deposited or sinks to the bottom, or some of it, of course, is exported to the ocean, depending on the entrance conditions and the size of the rainfall. But that plume can also produce strong stratification. Most obvious in this first initial stage is in salinity, because the fresh water tends to skirt across the top. So everything is a bit of a mess in this scenario. Now the next stage is you could call it the recovery period, but from a catchment perspective only, really. The vegetation begins to return and you start heading back toward the condition of the pre-fire state. But again, that's modulated by the fire severity. In some really extreme cases in the far south coast, for example, even this far along, so many months after the fires, we're seeing cases where the vegetation just isn't coming back. But yeah, the impacts of all the material deposited in the low energy environments of the waterways are still persisting and still being expressed. So the excessive nutrient loads exported from the catchment and the breakdown of deposited organic matter, both unburnt and partially burnt, fuels algal growth, which in turn results in mass oxygen consumption. And once the blooms collapse, the release of dissolved nutrients from the sediments of the estuary forces a feedback loop of further algal growth, which again drives algal consumption and so on and so on. So the whole biogeochemical cycling of an estuary is completely altered, which may have ongoing ecological consequences that are not truly recognised until months and months after the initial shock of the fires. So we've seen this happen, or we are still seeing this happen. This is an example from the Wonboyn River of the far south coast. It was extensively impacted by fire. Something like 90% of the catchment area burnt. And just like up in the mid-coast area, it was lashed by back-to-back rainfall events shortly after. I think there was back-to-back 100 mil and 200 mil rainfall events, I'm pretty sure. So what the plots show is data from that post-fire recovery period, so weeks to months after the heavy rain. So you can see the strong stratification of salinity, chlorophyll A, and dissolved oxygen is still evident along the entire length of the estuary, right down at the ocean end all the way to the upstream limit. Now, with the coming summer, warmer weather, increased light, what we're expecting to happen, it's probably going to start fueling further algal blooms and kickstart that process I mentioned before, that feedback loop of ongoing blooms throughout the summer. So again, I feel like this is almost like a precursor state to things that we might be witnessing in its full effect a bit later on. And this could be similar. This could be potentially a similar case of what's going on of fire-affected systems of the same type in the MidCoast Council LGA. Cappinghat comes to mind. It's an intermittently closed system with a bit of a deeper basin at the back and a tributary flowing in. Of course, we don't have any evidence to show that it is going on. Taking a look at our report card, where it dropped is quite significantly the worst time in 10 years. It does suggest there is significant impact in that system. Of course, rivers would be different. The data isn't shown here, but in the Clyde River down near Bateman's Bay, where we did similar vertical depth profiles to this along the whole length of the river. And again, it was a very extensive fire impact in the catchment. But what we see is a mixed signal the whole way down. So this might come back to residence time, meaning a high residence time and poor flushing might mean a higher risk to ongoing ecological impact in the waterway. So just to wrap up, the combined effects of bushfires and floods definitely have the potential to impact water quality and aquatic ecosystem health. As Peter pointed out, the timing and the scale of these major climatic events makes it really difficult to identify the extent of the impacts of the fire and the flood alone. And instead, we're kind of viewing everything all entangled together. And we're definitely leading towards, it seems that estuary type definitely modulates the impact. So where you have high residence time and the system's poorly flushed, it's probably going to be worse, and low residence time with well-flushed systems, there might be a bit more resilience in there. So to keep going with this work, to really get an understanding, to enhance our understanding of how fire impacts system, I think long-term monitoring is absolutely essential, as is targeted experiments. I think the long-term monitoring would really support some experimental data. And we've got to start, maybe we should think about sampling some relevant indicators, organic matter, for example, and some indicators of pyrogenic carbon, which will give us an idea of how combusted material from the fires is actually playing a role in influencing the aquatic ecosystem health indicators. Ongoing assessment of stratification, characterising the sediments is very important, because that's where the sources of pressure are now coming from. But also our work has been limited very much to the estuarine receiving environment. It would be really great to take this upstream and have a look at some of the streams and tributaries that flow into the larger systems. And of course, with our conceptual model, we've kind of got an idea for targeted sampling now. So in the very frightening future of possible fires happening again and more floods, we're almost a bit more prepared for some more sampling. We hope they don't happen, but from an understanding of the processes, it would be great to get out there and monitor these systems again. So that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Excellent, thank you, Aaron. That was really informative. Obviously, in this area, we were so heavily impacted by the fires. So this year, what we've actually done is we've included a fact sheet in with our report card that looks at how bushfires and the floods actually affected our waterways, and it's got some information on there as well on the work that Aaron and his team have been doing. So at the end of the session, I'll include some information on how to access these documents. Next up, we have Dr. Angus Ferguson is going to join us, and Angus is going to talk. So we've talked about monitoring, and we've talked about why we undertake that monitoring, but in actual fact, there's a step before the monitoring and a step that you then continue after monitoring, and that is catchment modelling. So Angus is going to talk us through a little bit about how that catchment modelling works.
Hi everyone. Sorry about that little technical glitch. Yes. So I'd like tonight I'll be talking about modelling, and further than just catchment modelling, it's what we refer to as ecosystem response modelling, which is really just a grab bag of different models that we put together to help us really understand how all the different factors interact to result in the sort of impacts that we see in receiving waters. So I guess just a brief overview. I'll be talking about how these sort of models help us to link what happens in the catchment to ecosystem responses that we see in systems like Wallace Lake. So I'll be breaking that down a little bit further and talking about the catchment models that we use that describe the processes and that go on within the catchments of those systems. I'll be talking about the hydrodynamic models, which describe the way that the water moves through the systems and mixes. And then further on to the ecosystem response models, which describe how the ecology of the systems responds to the input of fresh water and pollutants associated with that fresh water. And then I'd just sort of like to move on to some what we call effects-based assessments. These are case studies of examples about how we use the models to help management decide and prioritise the best management practices in order to reduce the impacts of land use on receiving waters. So the Great Lakes is obviously an area of great significance for many reasons. It's a popular tourist destination. It supports a large commercial fishery and oyster farming industry. And it also supports a vast array of ecological values, both in terms of fish, but also bird life and also lots of things that you probably don't really notice on a day-to-day basis, the animals that live in the sediments and in the fringing wetland habitats. So a recurrent question for management is, well, how can we maintain these values into the future, especially in the face of increasing population and pressure on natural resources? I mean, we can take a general grab bag approach and just say, well, pollution is bad, but really our approach is to actually drill into the problem a bit further using these models, supported by research and data that's collected, and as Peter and Aaron have alluded to, that ongoing monitoring, which really supports our ability to understand the system, but also help us develop the models further and track how the system is faring. So I guess the overall aim is to link land use activities to how the system responds. And I'll break this thinking down because it underpins our modelling approach, and it gives us, it will help you understand the rest of the presentation. So essentially what we look at is pressures, what we call pressures, and those are things like the various land uses which produce the pollution. So there are broadly, I'm just illustrating here with land use pressures such as grazing, cattle grazing, forested catchments, and also urban catchments. They will produce what we call stressors. These are things like sediments that are washed off the land, and also nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus. These are exported from the land to the waterways, and then they are mixed or transported and mixed into the receiving environment or aquatic environment. And then we look at what the response is. So what happens to the microalgae that grow in the water, which is the phytoplankton, the seagrass, which grows on the sediments of the system, and things like the oysters, and also the general habitat of the system. So there is various measures of that habitat quality. So our model setup is comprised of a catchment model, which basically describes the linkage between these pressures and the generation of sediments and nutrients. We then use what we call a hydrodynamic model, which describes the physics of the transport of that material through the system and the mixing with receiving waters. And then we couple that with what we call an ecosystem response model, which describes the various processes and feedbacks associated with this response side of the thing. So the catchment models, basically they're telling us how much stuff is coming off the catchment and from where it's coming. So essentially their basic processes which drive these models are the catchment area, the elevation and topography of that area, the land use types, and the soil types that are associated with that. We also can account for various other things which might affect the export of material, such as point sources or feedlots and sewage treatment plants, for example. Maybe irrigation and cropping, which may modify the way that water moves through the landscape, and also impoundments or such as dams. But essentially, these models look at the input of rainfall over the landscape, and they predict the flow off of water through streams and also through subsurface flows such as groundwater. So essentially, the sort of inputs that we need for these catchment models are things like land use maps that describe the different land use types that we see across the catchment. Each of these different land use types will have different sorts of pollutant generation rates. We have the catchment slope or topography, and we have the soil types. And the sort of outputs that we get are things like erosion rates, the production of total phosphorus or total nitrogen, and also the amount of water that's running off these landscapes. You'll notice in these maps here, they're all broken up into these tiny sort of mosaic pattern. That relates to what we call subcatchments. So they're individual small streams have their own individual catchment before they sort of join other streams and then concentrate further downstream. Then we have what we call the hydrodynamic model. This describes where the stuff goes once it hits the waterways. So in the right-hand panel, you'll see an animation of a runoff event discharging through the Wonboyn River into the Wallace Lake system. So this really helps us put into perspective what in this example, the Wonboyn River, how far that material goes and how it is affected by wind and tides and how it's mixed into the lake itself. Excuse me. So we can do this for individual inputs in isolation, such as this animation with the Wonboyn River, or else we can do more realistic simulations where we simulate the runoff from all events, all inputs at once. So essentially then we take those outputs and then we run it through what we call an ecosystem response model. And this really looks at the processes that cycle the nutrients and the suspended sediments within the receiving waters and how it affects the ecology. So on the left hand, we have what we call biogeochemical processes. These are really the processes that deal with the growth of microscopic plants and bacteria in the system, which essentially affect the availability of nutrients and light. And then we have more general models which describe how that feeds up the food chain or food web. So we have nitrogen and phosphorus coming into the system that feeds or fertilizes the tiny plants in the water, the phytoplankton, and also the microalgae on the sediment. Those are in turn food for tiny animals in the water column, what we call zooplankton, excuse me, and fish, and further up the food web to birds. In the sediments, we have another food web which flows all the way up to some of the things that people like to catch, like crabs and prawns. So essentially, we're really trying to sort of close the loop. We're trying to sort of understand the impacts of what we do in the catchment on the things that we like to enjoy within the system, such as birds, fish, crabs, and prawns. So in terms of management, the way we're using these models, one of the ways we use them is for what we call text-based assessments. So we have our what we call our model suite, which is this integrated system of models: catchment, hydrodynamic, and ecological response models. The catchment model gives us a measure of our pressures, and the hydrodynamic and ecological response models give us how the system responds. So if we run that, we can derive this sort of relationship between the pressure, in this case, the production of total nitrogen from a land use or from a catchment, and relate that to the production of microalgae in the system. In this case, the measure of chlorophyll A, which Peter talked about as one of the indicators in the scorecards. And basically what we see is that as we increase the production of total nitrogen from the catchment, we get a positive increase in the amount of phytoplankton. So the community, based on their expectations for clear water and no algal blooms, may require a state such as this, and that may well represent, which is basically better than what we've got now. So in this case, it's 20% less than the existing total nitrogen loads from the catchment. If under projected population growth within the catchment, we don't do anything to control the stormwater quality in the urban development, we can expect total nitrogen loads to increase, and therefore the chlorophyll A in the system to increase. if the council implements business as usual water sensitive urban design for that new development and retrofitting, we may expect a slight improvement in the situation. If there's a concerted effort, well, if otherwise they may opt to maintain the current scenario. If, on the other hand, they opt to invest in improving the situation, they could reduce the nitrogen loads and therefore the chlorophyll A concentrations. But of course, all of these come with a price tag, and it is basically then up to management to make that cost benefit analysis about how much they spend for the predicted outcomes. So this is one really powerful use of the modelling suites that we develop. The other is to test or predict and the benefits for different management practices. That's MPs. And in this case, we're looking at the power of riparian fencing in upper catchments to reduce stock access to waterways. And so basically we have the ability to predict how those interventions might play out in this particular area of the catchment. And when we run those through the model, we can sort of see what the benefits of those sort of schemes might be. In this case, a 40% reduction in total phosphorus loads for this particular subcatchment. We can also use the modelling to prioritise where catchment works should be done. You know, often where managers are faced with a really wicked problem. You know, that the system is the problem is absolutely huge, and they have limited funds, and they really need a tool to help them prioritise where to spend their money to create the best bang for buck. In this example, I'll just draw on some work we did in the Lake Macquarie catchment further south, which was looking at the impact of wastewater overflows from the sewer network. And you'll notice in this map of modelled sewer overflows, they're occurring everywhere. During every storm event, the sewer overflows and you get a discharge of raw sewage to the system. So the question that we were answering was, well, which of those overflows are having the greatest impact on the system? And obviously, we could either guess, we could use the South Park approach, or we can use our modelling suite, and that's what we've done. So we've basically used the model to help us pinpoint where the greatest impacts are occurring, and that gives council greater assurity about how they can best use their limited resources. So I'll leave it there. Thanks for listening.
Thank you to all of our special guests tonight. That was great to hear from all of you. Peter, it was so great to hear from you, and Peter told us about how we were tracking compared to the other estuaries, how important the long-term monitoring is to track the ecological health of our waterways, and that link between the predictive modelling and the management effectiveness, which Angus also touched on as well. It was great to hear Aaron talk about the impact of our estuaries under different climatic conditions, and like really this year we have faced the absolute big three, the worst three that you could get really. We've had extended period of drought followed by the bushfires, followed by the flood, and that has really had an impact. So it was great to hear a little bit more about that, and also Angus talking about that modelling and how we can use that to understand the complexities of natural systems. So I'm going to ask all of our presenters to join us on screen now, please. Excellent. So just again, we've got Peter, Aaron, Angus, and also Prue Tucker from MidCoast Council. So we're going to just do this as a panel. As I said, add those questions in there and we'll start talking about them. So I'll start off with one for you, Peter. So given the long-term data that we have available in this area now with so many years of the report card, How long do you think it will take for our waterways to possibly return to their slightly better grades, what we're used to seeing now that we've had these events that has dropped the scores so significantly?
Okay, that's an interesting question. We know that the systems react quite quickly to the inputs, at the matter of weeks to months. So if it had been any other year, I'd have said it'll get better straight away. But as Aaron pointed out, if very large amounts of material have been moved from the fires, particularly into our more coastal lake systems, there's potential for effects that could last many, many months. We might expect to see places like Kappangat, which had the really bad fire in its catchment and poor water and poor flushing or poor exchange through its entrance, then it might last through this summer. But it'll get better over time. And in the larger systems, the rivers and even Wallace Lake, I'd expect it to be the effects of last year to be gone by the time we get around to this summer.
Thank you. Aaron, I'll direct the next one to you, and I noticed that you did type an answer, but just to have it on camera so that everybody can hear. So the question was asked, after the fires, when the soil becomes hydrophobic, how long does it take until water infiltration returns to normal?
Good question, and I don't know. That's the honest answer. Look, I have done little bits of reading about things like this, the various forms of recovery, and what I have read that, hydrophobic soils respond really well to contact with water, but we have no data on that, so I couldn't say anything with confidence that could go on. I imagine the hydrophobic soils are very spatially variable across the fire impacted systems. Very probably driven by a number of factors: the condition of the soil characteristics and the vegetation characteristics before the fire, but also the fire severity probably impacted that. So yeah, I can't say for sure how that would go.
Okay, not a problem. That's how science works. Sometimes I don't know until we do a little bit more research and see how things go.
Yeah, but I mean, it's probably a good question for a soil scientist. So yeah, but maybe not an astroecologist.
Angus, I'll direct the next one to you. So it's kind of a little bit of a double-barreled question. So first of all, what field data has been collected for the catchment model? So what field work is done there as well? And then there's also the question being asked, and obviously this is quite relevant both in the Wallace catchment and then also Manning as well, and probably some of our other areas. Does the catchment model consider acid sulfate soils?
Great questions. First off, the sort of data that we collect for the catchment models, aside from things like land use distribution, the really important data we need is stream flow or stream discharge, and also the concentration of the pollutants in the water, in particular during a runoff event. So we know that as the water starts to rise, material starts to get washed off the catchment, and basically the concentration of the material in the water varies as it rises and drops. So we basically have a program where possible we go out and do what we call flow weighted sampling. So that's sampling at the outlets of major catchments during a rainfall event to collect those sort of data, and they give us what we call event mean concentrations and give us a good idea of how much material is moving off the catchment. In terms of the acid sulfate soil question, the models that I presented are really focused on the movement of nutrients and sediments from upper catchments. They're not really suited for acid sulfate soils. We are in the process of developing a different subset of models which can deal with acid sulfate soils, but essentially you're dealing with a very different problem and a different environment, one that is pretty much restricted to the floodplains, and and very much associated with groundwater movement through those back swamp acid sulfate soil environments. So yeah, there are different kettle of fish. We definitely have the conceptual ideas about how to deal with them, but we're currently sort of developing those models in collaboration with various universities around the country.
Excellent, thank you so much. Let's jump to the next one. So Peter, I'll jump back to you. There's a question about the algal growth in the Manning on distance over time. How has the Manning been tracking over the last 5 to 7 years, noting that some of the sites were only added in the last few years for the report card?
So we've got data back to 2014 in the Manning, and it's actually remarkably stable. The Lower Manning Estuary hasn't changed grade since 2014, so it hasn't got any better, it hasn't got any worse, and the same for the Mid Manning. And the only change that we've seen is it dropped 1 grade, sampling immediately after the big floods in the Upper Manning. So the Manning is actually quite stable and tracking along at a B, which is quite a good score for such a large river.
Excellent, thank you. So Prue, I'm going to throw to you next. So the question is, obviously we've had so many years of the report card now. What is Council doing in reaction to these report card results? What sort of management actions are they undertaking? Do you have any specific examples of places where we've done management actions?
Yeah, cool. So we've had a couple of examples where the report cards really helped us focus our efforts. So in the Wallamba River, when the Water Quality Improvement Plan was presented to us in 2009, we noted that the Wallamba River and Pipers Bay were 2 areas, or Pipers Creek were 2 areas we were quite concerned about. So in the Wallamba River, we've focused our efforts over a number of years to actually rehabilitate the waterway itself, like the actual Manning River estuary. There's some areas along the Wallamba River estuary which are actually just eroding into the estuary, so that's a direct source of sediment into the estuary. And over the years, we've been able to put erosion control by the way of rock fillets in that location over nearly 6.5 kilometres of river, which is a great story to tell. We're also focusing on the Wallamba catchment this last financial year. We've identified 3 key locations where we're stabilising crossings. So where dirt roads cross rivers, that's a really big source of sediment because you're capturing all of the water off of those dirt roads, and that ends up into the river and then eventually into the estuary. So we've put some effort into the catchment, especially around those erosion issues. For Pipers Creek, now this has been a real focus, and particularly for my work program. Pipers Creek actually drains the majority of Foster, so it has urban runoff from a lot of land that hasn't actually had any treatment. So as you know, when it rains and there's hard surfaces, that water's fast-tracked into our estuary without treatment. So what we tried to do in this space is identify locations on public land where we could insert some sort of more natural systems into the urban form, and that includes things like wetlands, which naturally filter nutrients and sediments out of the stormwater, and other filters like bioretention. Now, we've identified a lot of locations. We've got a few more to go, but the other thing we've been doing in all of our urban areas, particularly in Wallace Smith and Mile Lakes, is we've put in place a development control plan for water quality, and that development control plan puts controls on development so that no new impacts occur as a result of those developments going ahead. So they need to manage their own stormwater on site, filter and treat it before it ends up into our estuaries. So there's a couple of examples.
Is there any point source structural installations being installed? They've asked about, and Gavin, thank you for the question, to delay post-fire sediment entering the waterways. But I think really we're not looking necessarily directly at the point sources for post-fire sediment, but Prue, did you want to talk a little bit about WUSID and the things that we're undertaking in order to try and stop all sources of pollution entering the waterways?
Sure, thanks, Erin. So what I was talking about before was the focus on water sensitive urban design and building natural features into the urban form in order to filter sediments and nutrients out of the stormwater before they end up in the estuaries. But just in response to the fires, yes, you can put in place physical structures to slow down the water and to stop the runoff from entering into the estuaries. But one thing you can also do is just restore those natural systems. So council staff have worked really hard to get grants more recently to put in place some of those actions. We've got a few grants underway. The first project's a 3-year program that will undertake works on those fire affected lands. And that'll include things like bush regeneration, the removal of weeds, planting local tree species and koala food trees, and installing nest boxes for the fauna that's been displaced as a result of the fire. There's also an aspect of monitoring in that program to look at the recovery of that fauna and that natural ecosystem. In addition to this, we've recently received funding for a 1-year program, and that's to focus on the areas at Minabah and Cat-Eye to help protect endangered species like the giant dragonfly and also a couple of endangered plant species. And we also have a 1-year weed management program. So obviously weeds are some of the primary colonisers in those fire affected areas, and restoring our systems to their natural form is really the focus of this project. And if you put in place the more natural ecosystem, then there's more chance that those systems with their deep-rooted vegetation will start to operate more naturally and filter the nutrients and sediments out of any runoff. So that program goes right across our local government area, and it's going to have a lot of on-ground works, and that'll happen over public and private land. So there's some exciting projects underway.
Thank you. This one's for you, Aaron, and this is an interesting one, something that I've not necessarily thought about before. Could the burnt material that enters the waterway provide nutrient to things like seagrass communities? Is there any benefits to that side of things?
Yeah, it's a good question. I have a partial answer, and then I might throw to Angus to kind of finish me off. But I mean, the way I kind of see seagrass are kind of facing a double whammy of pressure when it comes to responding to the fires. Firstly, from the fact that those initial impact conditions that I showed before, with lots of fine ash material being sent out into the waterway, which really reduces the light climate. It's the main thing it's relying on for growth. So that would have been a shock to the system, definitely. But then I'd imagine also the bioavailable nutrients that are available in the water column as through that feedback loop that I showed you. Seagrass now has probably it's facing competition from phytoplankton growth and macroalgal growth as well, that it would also be in there opportunistically utilising that glut of bioavailable nutrients. So yeah, providing nutrition for them or providing, competition, I'm not really sure. Angus, maybe you want to add something to that?
No, well, I think you sort of really nailed it in terms of what we know. But I think I'll just relay some observations that were made in our recent survey of fire-affected catchments in the South Coast. And our team that went down there to do surveys reported that virtually every seagrass bed they saw, the seagrass was looking unhealthy and was basically brown, especially in the shallow areas. So we really don't have an adequate explanation for that yet. It could be some sort of the after effects of some sort of acute exposure to fire runoff, or an ongoing effect of pyrogenic material on those communities. So essentially that's it's one of those things we've been alerted to that we didn't know, from being proactive and monitoring these things.
Excellent. Showing how that science and research is so important and ongoing. We don't always know everything. We need to keep researching and monitoring and finding out new things, which is fantastic. Peter, I'll chuck the next one to you. How does the Manning score compare to other big rural rivers like the Tweed, Richmond or Clarence? Oh, and you're on mute. It's like the catchphrase for 2020.
Yes. I didn't have it on hand, so I've frantically been trying to look for it. Generally, it's marginally better. So the last 3 times we've done the Richmond River, it scored a D, a B and a C, whereas the Manning's consistently been a B. So, and the Tweed was a C, a B and a C. And again, the Manning's consistently a B. So it's in slightly better condition than the Richmond and the Tweed.
Excellent. Thank you for quickly looking them up for us. That's an interesting see how it is comparing to others. Aaron, there's one here for you.
I suppose I'll just get on my hobby horse a little bit more, and that illustrates the benefit of making sure that our monitoring is consistent across the state and making sure that the work that you're doing is consistent with the statewide program, because we can now start to make those sorts of comparisons.
Yeah, and absolutely, that's a fantastic point, because it is not just, we're not just here in isolation. We're part of a larger area, so it's nice to see. Aaron, I'll chuck back to you with this one. Any insights into sedimentation as one of the impacts of fires, particularly in relation to shallowing and sediment sinks?
Yeah, it's a good question again. And this touches on things that Peter and I said in the presentations, given, the fact that after the fires there was 4 times the monthly average of rainfall in a couple of days. It remains to be seen that there probably is sedimentation impacts, but were they exacerbated by the fire? I guess the point I'm trying to say is, at that scale of rainfall and that scale of runoff, there was going to be mass amounts of sediment exported from the catchments of all the systems anyway. So yeah, it's hard to say if we're out sampling and we're collecting sediment concentrations in during flood flow and they're exceeding something like 300 milligrams a litre or something, when you're getting around 2 or 3. Is that made worse by fires, or is that just a flood signal? It's hard to say. So so I definitely think at that scale of rainfall event and the subsequent runoff, there would be issues. There probably is issues with sediment built up in the system. A lot of it would have been exported straight through the ocean in a lot of systems, but when it did fall out, there would be small changes. But again, when you ask questions about before and after, you'd like to, especially I saw in the Q&A, there was a question about the bathymetry. So is it making areas more shallow? You would need a really comprehensive before survey and then after survey to answer that question comprehensively.
I can probably jump in based on some data from one of our collaborators at Southern Cross University. They had a long-term data set collected by citizen science groups in the Macleay, and they showed that basically the after effects of the fire, the suspended sediment concentrations were 5 to 10-fold higher than any other rainfall event previous. So they're really, and also other materials like phosphorus and nitrogen were many times greater than previous. So that's direct evidence that the fires had a huge impact. And also we've got photos from national parks down in Kosciuszko that showed drifts of sediment that burying roads by up to, what was it, Peter? About
nearly 2
meters.
Yeah, nearly 2 meters.
So basically, massive mud flows covering, moving down these systems after the fires.
But I also think that everything that we've said is that Angus said is true, that the amount of sediment in the water, and that creates shading problems for plants and things like that. But the reality of that, once it settles out, is it really only represents a few millimetres of mud, new mud on the bottom. So I think we need to separate this idea that the sediment suspended in the water column is critical for many processes, but it doesn't necessarily lead in the estuaries. I'm talking about not up in the rivers, but in the estuaries, to large changes in the depth of the estuaries. It's pretty much every time we've looked at these questions of massive shallowing, it's been found to not be supported by the evidence that we can get. But up in the rivers, it's a real issue.
I guess just one final comment would be that I think that the impact of the sediment export in relation to the fires is that while the catchments are still recovering, there isn't great vegetative cover at all those strata levels. There's going to be more material moved out during the smaller events that wouldn't normally mobilise material from a vegetated catchment. So I think there's probably like ongoing problems with sediment export and what that means for how it's deposited into the waterways until the vegetation has a chance to recover and it can start to shore everything up again.
Thank you all for jumping in there. That's an excellent answer. So we're starting to get close to the end of our time. There is one more question though that I'm going to direct at Peter, but what I might actually do is, I know that we have a great graphic that will help you answer this question. So just before we jump to Peter, I'm just going to share my screen and show you where you can access all of this information tonight. So we've talked about the report card and the document itself is now available on our website. So I'm just going to bring that up for you. Won't be a moment. Okay, so hopefully you can see this now. So this is the actual page on our website. So if you just go to MidCoast Council and type report card into the search function up the top here and navigate to 2020 Waterway and Catchment report card. So all of the information is on here. We've got a video that you can actually watch from earlier this evening as well. We've got our technical report, which has a little bit more information on the science behind and the actual results itself. We've also got the raw data included there for you to look at, and our fact sheet on waterways and how they're affected by bushfire and flood. And down here we've got the report card document itself. So here we are with our great Michael, who came and did our sampling for us this year, showing how we actually undertake the sampling there on the cover. But Peter, the question that was actually asked was how, that's actually the wrong document. Sorry, I've put in the wrong, just one moment and I'll bring it up. Okay, so here's the report and the results in the centre section you can actually print the into. But Peter, the question is, how did the estuaries respond to different events? So did you want to just chat about that and talk about this graphic that we've on the back here that talks about different estuary types?
As Angus and Aaron and I said, that there's this interaction between the rain and the river flow or the waterway flow and what's in that water. So when the water runs off the catchment, it brings nutrients in. Now, the plants grow in response to those nutrients, but they don't do it instantaneously. It takes hours to days to grow. If the water's moving through the system so quickly that the microscopic algae get swept away and they don't grow quickly, we actually don't see a very strong response to the introduction of nutrients. And that's largely what happens in the big rivers. If you have a small amount of rain that brings the nutrients in, it doesn't increase the flow, then you see quite a strong response in the rivers because a lot of nutrients being brought in, but the water's not going so fast it washes it all away. If you've got high rainfall, then the stuff gets washed through the river as quickly as the plants can grow, and so we don't see a strong response. And that's what we saw in the Manning River this year. On the other hand, if the water tends to get trapped in the system or move through the system very slowly, which is the case in the Mile Lakes or Kappangat or Wallace Lakes, then the nutrients are present for a much longer period of time and the algae are stimulated and able to grow, and you see a strong response. So it's a bit counterintuitive that in some circumstances when lots of stuff's washed in, if the waters are moving through like we've got a flood, then we don't see a very strong response until the waters start to slow down again. But if you're in a system where you don't have strong flows, then you see a strong response. And that's what we've tried to explain in the graphics that's on the screen, and that's included in the report card.
So once again, I would like to say thank you so much to Peter, Aaron, Angus and Prue for joining us this evening. Thank you so much for presenting and then also for answering all those great questions that everybody posed, and to the attendees that came. I know you're giving up an evening sort of around that dinner time as well, so we thank you so much for coming and being interested in what's happening in our waterways. We couldn't do this without you, so thank you so much for attending, and we hope to see you again in a future event.